At 2:01 a.m. in early January 2026, helicopters landed in Caracas, and within hours, control over assets valued at $17.3 trillion quietly shifted. Was this about Venezuela, or about the US dollar itself? When empires face mounting debt, history shows they don't collapse overnight. They reach for real assets: oil, gold, silver. This episode raises an uncomfortable question. What does it mean for your savings when hard assets matter more than paper trust? The moment control over Venezuela's oil reserves changed hands, the focus of global discussion shifted almost immediately, from politics to numbers. Not slogans, not ideology, balance sheets, debt trajectories, reserve assets. Because in modern geopolitics, the real story rarely sits on the surface. It hides in fiscal math. At the center of that math is the US dollar, still the world's primary reserve currency, but operating under conditions very different from those that built its dominance. US federal debt now exceeds $38 trillion, while annual interest costs have crossed $1 trillion, a threshold never reached before. These figures are not controversial. They come from Treasury and Congressional Budget Office data. What is debated is what they imply when placed alongside global behavior. This is where Venezuela becomes relevant, not as a cause, but as a signal. Historically, when states face long-term fiscal pressure, their response tends to follow a pattern documented across centuries. The Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, and the British Empire all encountered moments when monetary credibility weakened while obligations continued to rise. In each case, governments turned increasingly toward real assets, land, commodities, strategic resources, to stabilize systems that were becoming more abstract and debt-driven. In today's framework, that conversation naturally revolves around oil, because oil still underpins trade, logistics, and industrial capacity. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven reserves by volume. Valuations such as $17.3 trillion are not cash figures. They are long-term reserve estimates derived from publicly reported barrels and conservative price assumptions. Still, they illustrate why resource-rich regions remain strategically significant when financial confidence is under pressure. At the same time, something quieter has been happening outside military headlines. Central banks have been adjusting reserve compositions. Since the early 2000s, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from above 70% to below 60%, according to IMF data. That does not indicate abandonment, but it does reflect diversification. Alongside this shift, reported official gold holdings have increased, particularly among non-Western monetary authorities. This matters because reserve behavior reflects institutional thinking under uncertainty. Gold does not replace currencies in daily settlement, but it remains a neutral asset, free from counterparty risk. Silver, while more industrial in nature, historically plays a similar role during monetary transitions. Neither implies a prediction, only a preference for assets that exist outside policy discretion. The same logic applies to foreign currencies. Trade settlements increasingly use local or regional units, especially where bilateral agreements reduce exposure to exchange rate volatility. These arrangements are technical, not ideological. They reduce risk concentration rather than signaling systemic collapse. Yet tension emerges when fiscal and monetary policy begin to constrain one another. Economists describe this as fiscal dominance, a condition where debt levels influence central bank decisions more than inflation targets do. This concept is not speculative. It appears in academic literature, Federal Reserve discussions, and public remarks by former policymakers. When interest rates rise, debt servicing costs increase. When rates stay low, purchasing power erodes. Managing that balance becomes progressively harder as debt expands. None of this suggests inevitability. It suggests constraint. And constraint changes behavior, not only at the state level, but at the private level as well. Recent data shows elevated levels of cross-border wealth relocation, with capital moving toward jurisdictions perceived as stable, predictable, and asset-friendly. This movement does not require crisis to begin. It only requires uncertainty to persist. Here, historical precedent offers context rather than prophecy. Monetary systems rarely end abruptly. They evolve, stretch, and adapt, sometimes for decades. The British pound did not lose reserve status overnight. The transition spanned 2 world wars and multiple devaluations. For citizens and institutions, the challenge was not collapse, but gradual erosion of purchasing power. That erosion tends to expose a simple divide between assets dependent on confidence and assets anchored in utility. Currency relies on trust in issuing authority. Commodities rely on demand and scarcity. Neither is immune to volatility, but they respond to different forces. This distinction explains why discussions increasingly reference gold, silver, and strategic resources, not as guarantees, but as historical counterweights during periods of monetary stress. It also explains why these conversations resurface during moments like the Venezuela operation. Resource events sharpen awareness of what ultimately backs financial systems. Still, correlation is not causation. A military action does not determine currency outcomes. Debt does not mandate collapse. History offers patterns, not scripts. What it does offer is perspective. When financial systems grow complex, the assets beneath them regain attention. The unresolved question, and the reason this topic continues to spark debate, is whether current trends represent routine adjustment or something more structural. Is diversification simply prudent management, or early preparation for a different monetary balance? Reasonable analysts disagree, and that disagreement itself is revealing. Because when confidence is absolute, debate fades. When uncertainty rises, discussion expands. This is why the conversation matters, not as alarm, but as analysis. Not to predict outcomes, but to understand why oil, gold, silver, currencies, and debt are being discussed in the same breath again. History shows that moments like these rarely announce conclusions. They reveal pressures. And pressures, left unresolved, tend to reshape systems. Slowly, unevenly, and often in ways few expect. That tension is what keeps this story unfolding. And it's why perspectives on the dollar, foreign exchange, and defensive assets are no longer niche discussions, but central ones. If you see the patterns differently, that's worth debating. Because in periods like this, informed disagreement is often more valuable than certainty. And this is exactly why the Venezuela moment matters. Not because of who gained control, but because it revealed how systems behave under pressure. When debt, geopolitics, and monetary policy collide, value doesn't disappear, it repositions. That's what history keeps showing us. And it's why gold and silver, across centuries, quietly preserve purchasing power when trust in paper systems is tested. Zooming out, recent political moves, fiscal strain, and competition for strategic resources all echo earlier monetary transitions. This isn't collapse. It's adjustment. And this is only the beginning. Over the next few years, we're likely to see deeper shifts in how value is stored, priced, and protected, on Earth and increasingly beyond it, as technology and space-based resources enter the equation. So here's the question. How do you think this transition reshapes the role of the US dollar in the decade ahead? Share your perspective. This is Money Cycles, where we dig beneath headlines and explore the forces shaping what comes next. If you want to stay ahead of these shifts, you know where to find us. The future isn't written, but the patterns are.